This week's podcast contains explicit language and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
911. Yes, I'm calling for a young lady that ran into the house. She says she's just been raped. She's got a chain on her and everything. Send someone right away. This lady's naked and everything else. She said they've been holding her for 3 days.
This is True Crime Out Loud. This is the story of David Parker Ray, the toy box killer. And when I chose it and I mentioned it to a few people, I was surprised how many people did not know who David Parker Ray is or the toy box killer. And that's probably because most people talk about things that interest them. Like you can talk about guns all day long. Me, I speak serial killer. So I was very familiar with this. The toy box killer, don't let that make you think it has to do with children. It does not have to do with children. So I just want to ease your mind on that.
And I'm glad for that. I'm done with kids for a while.
Well, this is a horrific case. And to me, it just seems like it's so much worse than some of those more infamous cases that people know about. But I think you'll soon understand once we get into this why it's not well known. So we're going to start on March 22nd, 1999. Sierra County, Elephant Butte, New Mexico. There's a 911 call that came in, and what the operator heard was a scuffle, and then somebody hung up. So the operator called back. A woman answered and said, "Oh, it was an accident." Shortly thereafter, several 911 calls come in about a naked woman trying to stop traffic. One of those 911 calls is what you heard earlier, and it was a woman who had a nude woman wearing a metal dog collar with a chain. She was bloody and said she had been raped and held captive for 3 days, and she wanted them to send the police right away. So this caller was in disbelief, obviously, but what was discovered from this 911 call, or these two 911 calls, would unleash Pandora's box of secrets in this small town. I'm going to tell the story of the victim, Cynthia Vigil, and from here on out, I'll refer to her as Cynthia. So throughout this podcast, I'll call our victims by the first name and any suspects by their last name. So the 911 call came in. They identified it was Cynthia Vigil, and when the police arrived, they found her exactly as the caller had described. She was naked, she was wearing a dog collar, which was secured with a lock, and she was dragging a chain. She was covered in blood, bruises, punctures. Her breasts were black and purple, and the rest of her body was covered with bruises. She did not know where she was, like what city she was in. She said she had been held captive for 3 days in a trailer, and she told the police where to go. She started giving them information such as she had a bucket to use the bathroom in, and it was in a den, and in that den was a bed where she was strapped and chained to it. She said her captors were a man and a woman. She said the man had gone to work, and then the female stayed with the victim. The keys to her chains were left on a nearby table, so when the female went out of the room to make a phone call, the victim was able to scoot over close enough and grab the keys to try to escape. Well, during her escape, her and the woman got into a fight, and the woman had struck her in the head with a lamp. The captor had struck Cynthia in the head with a lamp. So then Cynthia grabbed an ice pick that just happened to be laying around, and she either stabbed or slashed, depending on which story you read, the female captor with this ice pick, and then she ran out and ran to a nearby home, which is the person who called 911. So the police also go to this first house where the 911 call came from. Nobody was home, but because it had been a 911 call and no one was answering the door, they went in, and when they went inside, they were able to see signs of a struggle. And then they were quickly able to link it with the other call that had come in about Cynthia Vigil. And they were able to verify Cynthia's story. They saw a bed that was in a sunken part of the living room. There was a waste bucket. A lamp was knocked over and broken. They found a bloody ice pick. And again, they saw the signs of a struggle. They also see a 25-foot enclosed utility type trailer. It's sitting next to the main home, but it's locked with 2 different locks. So from all this information Cynthia gave them, they were able to verify this, and look for the people who lived in the home, and they quickly were able to apprehend them and identify them as David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy. So from here on out, we'll be referring to them as Ray and Hendy.
All right.
So Cynthia was obviously scared out of her mind, and they took her to a local hospital, and she told them more about the story and about herself. She said she was a sex worker and a heroin addict, and she had met a John in Albuquerque. Now, Albuquerque is 150 miles away from Elephant Butte. She said the John was in a motorhome. She went into the motorhome to perform services. He shut the door, showed her a badge, and then said he was an undercover officer. So he put handcuffs on her. Well, she knew that something wasn't right with this, so she tried to fight, but there was a female in this motorhome, and the female shocked her with a cattle prod. So then she was driven a good distance away, and she didn't know. Like I said, it was 150 miles, and it was to Ray's home in Elephant Butte. At the home, she said she was drugged and chained to a bed, sexually assaulted, tortured, sexually tortured, and she could tell this was not their first time doing this. She was told to refer to Ray as master and Hendy as mistress, to only speak when spoken to, and they told her they would kill her like the others. She also said that a tape was played, an audio tape, that told her what was going to happen to her and that she would never see her family again.
That's weird.
Yeah, very weird. Well, I'm going to come back to that audio tape, but I want to cover a few more things first. They get Ray and Hendy and they question them, and both of them say, hey, she was a drug addict and we were trying to help her detox. And the sex acts that were performed were consensual and they had paid for them.
That doesn't sound... That sounds a little suspicious.
Well, that's their story. So let me tell you about David Parker Ray. When I saw a picture of him, it's not what you would expect to see. He was this older man. He had these little reading glasses that sat on his nose. He had this full mustache, and he kind of looked like somebody's grandfather. Ray lived in this mobile home in Elephant Butte, and Elephant Butte had a population of 1,431. So it's a very small New Mexico town. And it's a few miles north of Truth and Consequences, New Mexico. Ray had grown up in New Mexico. He was a mechanic, and he worked for Elephant Butte State Park. He was described by his friends and coworkers as a really nice guy and eager to help others and a good mechanic. This is where I go back to not only stranger danger that I preach to people all the time, but trust no one.
Right.
His house was on the shores of Elephant Butte Lake, and Elephant Butte Lake is the largest body of water in New Mexico. It's 43 miles long and 200 feet deep in some places. Police said about Ray that he was intelligent and able to avoid detection for many, many, many years. So Cindy Hendy, she was the female partner and girlfriend of Ray, and she worked at the state park with him. She said that she had abused drugs and alcohol and had prostituted herself after being kicked out of her home at a very young age. And she was also 20 years younger than Ray.
So now I want to talk about the toy box. The police department responded there to his property and obviously got the locks off of the 25-foot enclosed utility trailer on the property that he referred to as the toy box. And this thing had a sign inside that said Satan's Den. And once police got in there, they were astonished at what they saw. They estimated that he probably had $100,000 invested in this toy box. It had been soundproofed and it contained all kinds of sexually deviant devices. Stuff like chains and handcuffs and sex toys and all kinds of cages and pulleys and surgical blades and a doll that was in chains and bondage. But it even had some stuff that looked like he had made himself. There was a generator in there that looked like he had used it to inflict electric shock on his victims, and a drill that he had modified with a dildo type device for torture. They even found a 15-inch long PVC pipe, and he had it segmented off where it showed in inches, and it had nails melted into the end of it that he used as a dildo to mutilate the vaginal area and inner thighs. I mean, some sick stuff. All kinds of video cameras and still cameras with photos of women being tortured. He had a gynecology exam chair. I mean, he had a ton of stuff, a fur-lined coffin. But the police also found some detailed diaries that he kept regarding his victims, but they contained no names, only dates, and the number of times he tortured each victim. Some really weird stuff. And I guess he figured that maybe someone else would come in to use the toy box, because he even posted charts and instructions on how to use the homemade devices. Another one of those homemade devices he had, called it the ankle spreader. And it was, again, segmented off and went from 24 to 41 inches. It was like a metal bar with straps on the end that I guess he used to separate legs.
Yeah, and I'm going to put pictures of some of these things and a general picture of the toy box on our website so you can see.
But this guy had a device in the toy box where he was able to bend the victim over to immobilize them. And we find out later that he had dogs and his friends rape these victims. I mean, this guy, bad news for sure. They also found a map that had some X's on it, and they were on the lake portion there, the Elephant Butte Lake that he lived near. And he did have a large sailboat and equipment for diving and depth finding and that kind of thing. And the police did search where those X's were, and they didn't find anything. But they acknowledged that with his job, he had access to every part of Elephant Butte State Park, so they're not really sure what those X's meant or what they represented. They also found the audio tape that the victim referred to when she originally reported it to police. You weren't able to find a complete copy of that, were you?
No, I got the transcript, so if you go online and look for the transcripts, you can read it, but it was a lot and the tapes were long. But I do have a clip that I was able to get to play for people. But I also wanted to cover on that toy box, and I read this in several sources, and you can see in the pictures that he had a mirror on the ceiling so that the victims had to watch what was being done to them each time.
Yeah, this guy's pretty sick. Well, we're going to play the audio clip that you did find, but we want to let everybody know it does contain graphic language, like we said in the disclaimer at the beginning.
Hello there, bitch. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you. Now, you are obviously here against your will. You're going to be kept chained in a variety of different positions, usually with your legs or knees forced wide apart. You will be raped thoroughly and repeatedly in every hole you've got. You're going to be drugged up real heavy with a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital. You're not going to remember a fucking thing about this little adventure or what has happened to you. You're going to be kept like an animal. As far as I'm concerned, you're a pretty piece of meat. Your pussy and asshole is going to get a real workout. Be smart and be a survivor. Have a nice day.
B, tell me what you think about that audio tape.
That was pretty crazy. I've never heard anything like that in any other cases.
Yeah, and to think he was playing this for at least one victim we know of, possibly all of his victims, because the tape was recorded and part of the transcript shows in 1993. The case with Cynthia was 1999.
That had to be horrifying for the women to be hearing that, you know. They've just been abducted. I mean, they know what's about to happen.
Yeah, well, let's move on to the videotapes, because like I said, they found over 100 videotapes, and they went through watching them, and a lot of them were really just nothing significant. But one of them, they saw Ray testing the equipment. He's like doing a sound check, and he's doing it on camera, and he'll cut it off, and then he cuts it back on and does another check, and then he cuts it off and he cuts it back on, and there is a young blondish woman who appeared to be unconscious strapped to the exam table. The videotape shows him involved in rape and torture of this woman, but they didn't know who she was. They looked for anything distinguishing about her that they could send out to the media or ask around to see who it was. and she had a very distinct tattoo on her calf. So they took a picture of the video and they sent that out to the media, and they were able to find this woman. And she was living in Colorado, and her name was Kelly Van Cleve. So Kelly's story is just even more unusual than Cynthia's, as if we didn't think it could get any more unusual. They get with her, and what she tells the police is that she is a friend of Jessie Ray. And I'm going to tell you who Jessie Ray is in just a minute. So she's a friend of Jessie Ray, but she had no knowledge of ever being at the home of David Parker Ray. For a while, she had been having nightmares of being tied to a table and things being done to her, and duct tape scared her, but she just thought they were nightmares. Well, once she linked up with the FBI, she realized that these were not nightmares, that these things actually happened to her. And although her memory was fuzzy, she did know that this happened on July 24th, 1996. What they were able to determine from his diaries and from speaking with her, that she had been held for 3 days, and he just released her. We don't know the exact details of the release, or I couldn't find it. I saw varying stories, but nothing consistent. So we're just going to go with we don't know. But she was released after that 3 days and had no memory of anything happened. She remembers she was bar hopping with her friends, and she left one bar to take a drunk friend home, and she came back to that bar, and by the end of the night, it was just her and Jessie Ray. And Jessie was going to take her home, but then she starts remembering, well, Jessie didn't take me home. She drove me to David Parker Ray's home. And she thinks Jessie had possibly drugged her beer. She remembers being on the couch, a knife held to her throat, and a dog collar put on her, then duct tape and handcuffs. She remembers Ray coming and going several times, and she remembers pain. She doesn't remember eating or drinking. She does remember using a porta pot, and she was shackled to do that. But that's it. That's all she can remember, and that's after she realizes they're not nightmares. So let me tell you who Jessie Ray is. Jessie Ray is the adult daughter of David Parker Ray.
So she's luring her own friends in there?
That's what it seems like. And his daughter had become his accomplice.
Nice.
So Ray had 2 children, Jessie, his daughter, and her name was actually Glenda Jean Ray, but for some reason she was called Jessie. And he had a son, but he did not really have a close relationship with the son. Well, so they wind up arresting Jessie Ray, David Parker Ray, Cindy Hendy. None of them are telling them anything. But after a few days, Cindy winds up telling them a little bit more. She said in 1997, she was fleeing criminal charges, so she moved from Washington to Truth and Consequences, and that's where she met Ray. She worked at the same state park he did, and then she got involved with him romantically and then began living with him. She said she had watched him brutalize and torture these women, and occasionally she had helped torture. She said she enjoyed near-violent sex with rape fantasies, and she said her and Ray just fed off of each other. When they first got together, he told her of all the murders he had committed, and he said he had done about one a year for 40 years. In one of his tapes, he said he started these crimes at the age of 15. Do you know how old he was when he was captured?
No.
59. So from the time he was 15 until he was 59. Now, this is according to his statement in one of his audio tapes. Mm-hmm. So Hendy goes on to tell him, she wasn't exactly scared when he told her this. She was nervous, but she was also intrigued. He also told Hendy that he knew how to kill someone and bury them in a lake so that they wouldn't be found. And he said, quote, "You cut them down the belly, scoop out their guts, fill chest cavity with cement weights, then use baling wire to wrap them up."
Sounds like he's got it all figured out.
Yeah, well, obviously they haven't found any bodies at this time. So she said she had no remorse at the time for what she had done. She does remember their first victim together was Angela, who was a friend of hers, but they released Angela. She said Ray never hurt or tortured her being Hendy. She said that she had actually drove to Albuquerque and met up with the pimp who introduced her to Cynthia. And then Ray took it from there and invited the sex worker in the motorhome and what we've already heard. and that he impersonated an undercover officer, which he worked at a state park. I'm going to guess, well, from the pictures I've seen, I'm not guessing, they wore those brown uniforms, which around here, I know our sheriff's deputies wear brown uniforms. And for somebody who may be a prostitute or an addict, they may very well think initially that they are a police officer.
Well, yeah, and I've seen like even some state park employees around here having badges that don't really have any law enforcement authority. I mean, a state park ranger would have law enforcement authority within the park, but some state park employees have a badge that I don't know why they have it really, but that could easily be flashed real quick to gain somebody's compliance.
Well, whatever it was obviously working for him. Hendy was able to tell the police of 14 murders where she had direct knowledge. And she pointed out potential burial sites to the police where they searched. They didn't find anything. One big thing that she did tell them, as if all this other isn't big stuff, she told them that Ray had a friend named Dennis Roy Yancey. So the police go talk to Dennis Roy Yancey. And Yancey was not for the questioning very long before he told them what he knew. Yancey said that yes, he was a friend of Ray's. He had dated a girl named Marie Parker, and along with Ray, they held Marie Parker captive. He said when she wasn't being played with, as he called it, she was slid underneath the burners of a stove, and it was made like if you're looking at your stove where the oven is, it's like you open the oven, but it wasn't really an oven. It was like a cubby where they could put her in there, shut it, and padlock it.
That's weird.
Ray instructed Yancey to strangle Marie. He gave him the rope, and I don't know if this was now you're complicit with me or what the deal was for him making Yancey do it. This is Yancey's story because Ray hasn't told us anything. But he said when he was strangling her, she wasn't dying fast enough and she was struggling. He said once she was dead, he, being Yancey, and Ray took her body and they rolled it down a ravine and buried it. And he gave them specific instructions and directions to be able to locate this body. They didn't find it. What they conclude from this is they're pretty sure that Ray went back after the fact because he didn't want to leave any evidence behind and retrieved her body and moved it somewhere else. Marie Parker, the victim in this case, she was 21 years old when she went missing, and she went missing from the same bar in Truth and Consequences that our earlier victim, Kelly Van Cleve, had been at.
So they just trolled the same bar for victims all the time, it sounds like.
Well, no, I don't think it was that big of a bar because Truth and Consequences is not really that big. I think that it was just one place they had options because, remember, they went to Albuquerque to get Vigil, and she was 150 miles away. Mm-hmm. So Marie Parker, to this day, is still missing. No body has been found. She is presumed dead because of Yancey's confession, but her body has not been recovered. They locate another possible victim, Angie Montano. Angie tells them that she was a sex worker, and Ray said he was an undercover cop, his usual ruse, and he put handcuffs on her. She said she was held captive for 3 days, and she was tortured, and then she was just dumped on the side of the road. Now, there are several reports as to what happened after that. One I saw most often was that an off-duty officer saw her walking down the road, and she obviously looked in distress, and he gave her a ride. She told him what happened, and he offered to take her to the local police department to report it, but she refused. Other reports say that she reported it to the police, but there was no follow-up done. Those were the two stories, but I saw both stories in several places. They did not find the videotape of Angie Montano. They also find another possible victim. Her name was Jill Troya. They don't have any word from Yancey or anybody else that she was murdered, but she was last seen October 1st, 1995 at a restaurant/bar with Ray's daughter, Jessie. And according to the Charlie Project, Troya was 22 years old. She was biracial. She was Asian and Caucasian. She was 5 feet tall and 100 pounds.
And they've never heard from, seen her again or anything like that? They didn't have any tapes of her?
No, and she is still missing to this day as of 2021. Now that we know a little bit about the victims, let's move on to the trials. So, like I told you, Ray denied involvement in any crimes. Jessie denied involvement. Yancey ended up pleading to second-degree murder, and Hindi agreed to testify against Ray. Due to her cooperating, she was sentenced to 36 years. Ray was initially charged with 37 counts involving 3 women. The charges included kidnap and sexual torture, but he ended up pleading guilty to the charges against Cynthia Vigil. The charges were dismissed against Angie Montano, but he did go to trial for the charges against Kelly Van Cleve. Not only did he have a trial, there was a retrial. And with any kind of victim of sexual assault or attempted murder, making them go through the trial and tell their story is just victimizes them all over again. Kelly Van Cleve was strong enough to go through 2 trials. And she was their most credible witness because she was not a prostitute and she was not a drug addict. But the problem was she couldn't remember everything. The testimony they had was the videotape. The first trial against him involving Kelly, it was a hung jury. The second trial, he was found guilty. The first trial, they didn't allow that audio tape, the clip that we played for you, because she couldn't remember if he played it for him, so it wasn't allowed. Well, in the second trial, it was allowed, and I think that had a big part to do with him being found guilty. Ray had been held for 2.5 years awaiting his trial and the retrial. Part of his plea deal with the charges for his crimes against Cynthia Vigil was that his daughter, Jessie, was to be released. So Jessie was sentenced to 2.5 years and served 5 years on probation because they had been sitting in jail for the 2.5 years. So she was released. Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison, and he forfeited his right to appeal, again, as part of that plea deal. What do we know, or what do the police know about Ray? He's suspected to have killed a minimum of 40, but probably closer to 60 women in several different states. But the kicker to that, as of 2021, not a single body has been found.
That's incredible.
Not a bone, nothing. The police have done exhaustive searches, and they said they have searched anywhere and everywhere they could think of, but still nothing. In one interview I saw, Ray's own attorney said Ray doesn't deserve to be in society. Ray was convicted in 2001 on these charges and sentenced to 224 years. But less than a year later, in 2002, he told investigators he was ready to talk. So they were finally ready to get some information and bring these victims home to their families. However, just prior to this meeting with investigators, David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in prison. So no answers. Hindi was released in 2019. The last 2 years of her imprisonment were concurrent with parole. So when she was released, she has no supervision. She doesn't have to report to anybody. So Hindi ended up serving 10 years, which was less than a third of her sentence. Yancey, he got out at one point a few years ago, but due to a parole violation, he was put back in prison. He is set to be released this year, 2021. Another interesting thing, and this is where I kind of don't have some understanding, is in 2011, the FBI released images of women's items that were found in the toy box in hopes of identifying some of his victims, because there was jewelry, clothing, panties, bras. There was even a leather bracelet with the name Linda imprinted on it. They had, I believe, somewhere around 400, I can't give you exact number, articles that they did not believe belonged to Ray. In 2011, the FBI releases this. No one has come forward. So I want to talk about why this suspected serial killer is not well known. And I do believe the police are correct in his 40 to 60 victims, because it's not like Ray came forward once he got in prison and was like, okay, I killed this many people to get notoriety. He kept his mouth shut. They relied on his diaries and the words of his accomplices to get these numbers together. But I think the reason it's not well known is because there are no murder victims. He is a, quote, serial killer who's never been convicted of murder.
Yeah, and when you said that the accomplice, Yancey, was convicted of murder, I found that odd. It's unusual to see. Apparently they didn't have anything other than his testimony that they murdered somebody.
And I think it was part of a plea deal with him also. And another reason that it is not as infamous as some cases, I think, is because a lot of the victims were prostitutes or people living on what we say, the fringes of society. They just, what is the term people use? Less than dead because of their lifestyle. And that's heartbreaking because these are somebody's mothers. These are people's daughters. These are people's sisters. And it's heartbreaking that a lot of people don't even know if their loved one was a victim.
That may be one of the things that complicates locating victims. And in addition to them not remembering, families lose track of them and they don't know what their relative is doing. And then if they just disappear, a lot of people disappear without relatives even realizing it happened.
Yeah, and that's true. I think in 2011, when the FBI released these images of the women's items, I think the reason a lot of victims that didn't come forward, first of all, a lot of them don't have the memory of things happening because he was drugging them so much that they may not have ever even known and still to this day don't know. But also women that were victims, by 2011, he was dead. And to them, hey, I don't want to go forward and re-victimize myself. I mean, what's the point in doing it now?
And I can understand that. There really isn't a whole lot other than them having a chance to talk to someone about it. But more therapeutic for them, I would say, than punitive for him. He's obviously dead, so I guess I could see that.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest reason, though, it goes back to that, them just not remembering. Because, like I said, when they brought Kelly Van Cleve and questioned her, she had been having nightmares, but even with them telling her, hey, we're seeing you on videotape, she still could not remember. So that's the story of the Toy Box Killer, or David Parker Ray. And usually I like to list our podcast by the names of the victims because this is about remembering those victims. In the case of a serial killer or suspected serial killer, it's easier just to list by the suspect's name because a lot of times you have many, many victims. But in this case, as far as murder victims, we don't really know who they are. Well, let us know what you think on this case. You can email us at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. You can also follow us on Twitter at TC Out Loud. We look forward to hearing your comments.
We appreciate the case suggestions we've been receiving. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
Photos, links, and sources for this podcast can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.